Welcome to the Behavioral Interviewing module. Today we're going to talk about what a behavioral interview is and how best to prepare for the behavioral interview process. First, let's talk about what it is. The questions that are based in a behavioral interview are the characteristics a company wants to hire for. The interview is designed to uncover prior behaviors, so even though many of us believe that we have the ability to change, research would say that we are actually pretty fixed in how we behave. So the behavioral interview is attempting to get at the very specific parts of your past behavior, because the belief is that that is a predictor of how you will act in the future. It's a very structured format. Interviewers are typically assigned specific questions to ask, and they have to ask those same questions of every candidate. And then they are often given a way to evaluate the candidate, and it's something like a scaled answer of maybe 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 that shows how best you answered the question. So the advantages of this very structured approach is that it helps reduce the interviewer bias because they have to follow that structured format, and the questions are going to be the same. Therefore, the candidates are measured on the same criteria, and again, it's past behavior is the best predictor for future success. And so there's a lot of weight placed on the behavioral interview because of that format. Now, it's a very different interview experience because there's no speculation, only past behavior. You're not going to get a question about how would you lead in this situation, or what would you do if you found out that your profit was going to be underperforming by 4%. There aren't really what if questions. The questions are going to ask about what happened. So many of the questions start with, tell me about a time when, or tell me about when you've been doing X. So this is very much about a specific situation that you are in, not your team at large, but you are in. It will probably not feel very conversational because the interviewer is sticking to the questions, and in some cases those interviewers might be taking a whole lot of notes, so you may not get a lot of eye contact. It will be very challenging to establish rapport in some cases, which is why as you're walking to the interview, when you're here at the GBCC, or you're walking to the interview room if you're in a second interview on their property, you want to try and establish the relationship and the personality factor before the actual questions come in, because at the time of the interview it might be challenging to really get to know the person. And the questions will be different. Like I said, they're going to be predominantly questions that are, tell me about a time when, and reflecting on past experiences that you've had. When you're talking about preparing for the interview, think about what the company is looking for, the broader traits. And so as you're doing your networking and your informational interviews, what you want to do is ask the individuals that you're talking to, what is the culture like, and what do they value in terms of behavior. They may not be role-specific questions. They might be things like, tell me about a time when you were taking initiative. Tell me about a time where you had to make a decision without a lot of data. Or ask the individual that you're interviewing with, the informational interview that you might be having, what are some of the challenges that you see? So you might be able to predict some of the questions you will get. Another great way to begin prepping for the interview is to look very closely at the job description. Some of those job descriptions are hints at what they're looking for. So if the job description says needs to analyze reports and make forecasts, you can probably bet that there's going to be a question in your behavioral interview that might be, tell me about a time when you had to do analysis and make forecasts. And so there's a 1-for-1. And certainly that's not going to be the same across the board, but use it as clues as you're getting ready for the interview so that you have the best chance of predicting what they're looking for. Additionally, I want you to think about very specific examples of behavior that fit those traits. So here are a couple examples. Tell me about times when you had to resolve a conflict or persuade others to your point of view. These are very typical questions. And if you look at the packet that you've been assigned for your informational interview, there are a number of pages where it's going to give the opportunity to practice some of the more common questions that you will likely get. Also, if you go out to the GBCC website, you can also download 50 informational interview questions or behavioral interview questions, 40 of the tough behavioral interview questions, if you want even a broader list. So do feel free to use those as well. Okay, another part of prepping for the interview is formatting your answer. We use something that's called the STAR format. It's a very common way of answering, and it's going to feel probably a little fixed to you or a little formal to you, but know that this is a very effective way to talk to your story because it's easy for the person who's interviewing you to hear the different parts of your story. So I'm going to break down this different sections and talk about the important parts. And then give you, when you're doing your packet, I encourage you to do your notes in this format and get used to relaying it in this delivery style. Now, when you're answering a question, the answers to the questions are roughly speaking 2, maybe 2.5 minutes long. You don't want to get much longer than that. People start to lose interest. You start to look unfocused. So the way that you're going to start out is you're going to talk about the situation and task. And that is where you're setting up the context of the story. This is where you're going to take 30 to 40 seconds to tell them what the assignment was. So was the assignment, we had to get this report out. Was the assignment, we had to compile all this data and produce a recommendation for leadership. So that's the situation task. Where people get the most hung up is where they try and tackle too much of the context. So really boil down the very simplistic actual activity that you were assigned or your team was assigned at large, because sometimes that's part of it. And get to the root of what you're trying to tell about, because the second part, action, is really where you're going to go deep. So in your situation, a task, another thing that I like in a story, because this is a story, remember, I like when there is an element of pressure. It makes it more intense. If you just talk about, well, we had to get this report done, that's not a really compelling story. But if you say, I had to get this report done in 48 hours and get it to the client, that is something worth listening to. Or if you said, we had to reassess our situation, or we were going to be over budget by 10%, that's an element of pressure. There is something, because many of us are in work environments where there's pressure. And so it fits with what people would expect in a regular course of day-to-day. As you move into the action, this is the biggest part of your story. So you're going to spend about 60 seconds talking about what you did. Now note, many of us are in teams. Many of us do lots of collaborative work. However, in a behavioral interview, the point of the story is to talk about what you did. So be mindful of how much you're using I versus we. We can be what the entire group was assigned, but I is what you did within that work. So focus on your part of the process and be very articulate about expressing your thought processes. They want to hear that you made a decision at X point. They want to hear that you took the initiative here or at point Y. This is important because really this is where they're going to get the meat of the type of work that you do. So be mindful about the types of verbs that you're using. You want to talk about taking initiative, making decisions, making recommendations, and really tell what happened. If the story goes, we had to get this report done in 48 hours, what was your piece of that? And as you're going through the process, express the details that you know happened in your head, but that the interviewer won't necessarily understand unless you articulate them. Okay? The last section is the result. This section, and one more thing about action. I want you to include bumps. Most of the work that we do is not linear. We all have hurdles that we have to overcome. And this is important because it makes, again, going back to this is still a story, this makes the story more compelling. So if you have an element of pressure and you've included bumps, then you are showing that you have the ability to tackle hurdles that come in and to work in a pressure situation. Also with bumps, you have 2 lines that you can go down to. Either you're going to tell in your story how you've hit a bump and then you worked around it, or you got over it, or you've readjusted so that you wouldn't be stopped by this bump, or if this hurdle was so great and caused so much trouble for the project that you then made the decision of how you were going to keep your stakeholders informed, how you were going to reset expectations, and showing that sometimes there are bumps that you are so great, but the stakeholders were not caught off guard. Nobody likes surprises. So you're trying to show that you are either doing everything you can to get through it, and when you can't get through it, you keep people informed. The last section is the result. So if you've got the situation and task with an element of pressure and you have an action that includes a little bit of bumps, people want to know how the story ends. It's still a story. So in your result, you're going to spend 20 to 30 seconds expressing what the outcome was. If your story is too easy, if you only had to do a report and there were no bumps along the way, I'm not really compelled by your story. And I don't think the result that you earned is that fantastic. But if you had pressure and you had some hurdles you had to overcome, then your result feels earned. And by the way, the result does not have to be a happy ending. It can be that in some cases it's just a bad story, or not a bad story, a bad ending. But then you share your insights. Then you show how you learned from this and how you wouldn't make that same mistake again, or how you would take a different approach. So don't feel compelled to end happy. And in fact, some questions are going to be rigged so that they aren't going to be happy endings. So tell me about a time when you had to work with a difficult coworker. Tell me about a time when you missed a deadline. By the type of question it is intent. We already know that you didn't make the deadline. So know that sharing insights is the other way to kind of close up the story that you're sharing with the interviewer. So that's the layout that we recommend you do. Again, it might feel a little fixed, but as somebody who's listening and as somebody who has to listen to this 11, 12, 15 times for all the different students that they interview with, it is a very easy way for them to quickly absorb and grasp your main message. And going back to some of the earlier material about your brand, this also is where you can reinforce your brand and talk about the types of things that you're trying to hit again and again and again. Now, as you go forth and get ready for the interview, we do have resources. First, for Summer CAS, there is the small group interview practice here on campus, August 31st at 5:30, and this is the required completion of Summer CAS, so we look forward to seeing you here. After that, you can continue to do more interview practice. Beginning in September, when school gets started again, there's small group practice at the GBCC, and you can register for that in TalentLink. Those will be Monday through Friday at noon, and Monday through Thursday, 4:30 to 5:30. So there are times for you to jump in, meet with a small group of students, and continue to practice your interview skills. We also have a software that's called Interview Stream, and that is a subscription that's purchased by the university. You can actually go out there, pick some questions from their lineup, and they have hundreds of questions, and then you can be videotaped in your responses, and you can give yourself a 2-minute limit or a 2.5-minute limit, and then you can watch how you're asking yourself how you're responding to these questions, and look for things that you're doing. Do you have a lot of ahs and ums? Are you not being concise in your situation and task? All of those things could be picked up when you do the interview stream. At any time, you are welcome to make a 30-minute practice session with a coach. And then once fall starts and the interviews start in October, you're welcome to set up what's called a mock interview. And that is when you have an interview on the books with one of the companies that are here on campus, and you can meet with a coach and go prep literally for that specific interview. But you only want to set that up once you have the interview in your pocket, okay? And then, of course, you can do it with peers, mentors, friends, spouses, family. Everybody will, anybody that you can get to spend some time with you to practice your questions, because this really does take practice. So final thoughts, there's not any substitution for practice in this. This is not a natural way of us talking, and so it does take a while to get into flow. Some people like to bullet point out their answers so that they get a sense of it and then begin practicing. And the key is that you want to practice enough that it feels natural to you, but not practice so much that it feels like a script and you're not really engaging in the story. So as you're telling these stories, practice tone, practice pace, practice pitch, all of those things to help make your story come to life. And then do it again and again. And I usually coach students somewhere around 4 or 5 times per question so that you have said it enough that it feels comfortable, but it's not going to feel fixed or scripted or stiff. So practice, practice, practice. And then, of course, if you ever need help, do reach out to the GBCC. We're here to support you. We want you to be successful in the OCR process, and at any time we would be happy to help you in this area. All right, that's it for behavioral interviews. Thanks a lot.